with Graveyard Weeds and Wolfsbane Seeds by Sinan Maguire. It's Halloween, Mary told Cook while Cook boiled caramel and dipped apples and laid them on the table to dry, buttery and glistening in their new candy shells. Cook smiled indulgently and gave Mary a ball of caramel to play between her fingers and shooed her out of the kitchen. It's Halloween, Mary told Mr. Evans the gardener while he stuffed old clothes with hay and sticks and raised his new-formed scarecrows onto their stands, propping them around the grounds like watchful sentinels. Mr. Evans smiled, not quite as indulgently as Cook, and gave Mary a stick and some string to tie around it and shooed her out of the garden. It's Halloween, Mary told Mr. Blake the coachman while he oiled the hinges on the front gate so they would creak like such and not like so when the trick-or-treaters came to call. Mr. Blake smiled coolly and gave Mary an old horseshoe, heavy and red with streaks of rust like drying blood, and shooed her away from the gate, back toward the house. It's Halloween, Mary told herself, caramel and rust streaking her fingers, the stick shoved lengthwise into her hair so her ponytail held it in place, high and bobbing bright in the autumn wind. Atop the house, crows cawed their delighted caws into the air, and a curtain swayed, pulled aside and let go by an unseen hand. Delighted with herself, with the world around her, Mary tucked the horseshoe into her pocket and raced on. Growing up in the shadow of the Holston house means growing up understanding why people believe in ghosts. Believing in the ghosts yourself is optional, which is a good thing, because screw that, nobody's going to convince me that some peeping Casper is hanging around to watch me get my titties out at the end of the school day. Dead is dead. Dead moves on. But the Holston house, it makes you understand why people would believe. Why they might even want to believe. It should have fallen down a long damn time ago, for one thing. It's older than any other house in town, built when this was nothing but pastoral fields, evergreen woods, and horse farms for rich people. The Holstons had a buttload of money by old-timey standards, and to hear people who knew them before they died out, it was a lot of money by modern standards, too. The kind of money that sees a pretty field and says, I should build a giant-ass mansion there for no good reason, just because I want to. I shouldn't be too hard on them, dead old rich people that they are. This town exists because they built here, in case the name wasn't clue enough. Holston, Oregon, a nice place to live. The motto's not wrong. It's nice here. No crime, no drugs, nothing beyond a little teenage mischief that never seems to outlast high school. It's so nice it makes me sick sometimes, like it doesn't leave room for anything else. Guess old man Holston got what he wished for when he chose that motto. It's the rest of US who didn't have a choice. When rich people decide they need to build a house, they also decide they need to buy food, and clothes, and entertainment, and all sorts of other good things that make a house a home. So people followed them, one after the other, and then those people built shops to sell their shit out of, and they built houses to keep their shit in, and eventually they turned around and went, shit, I guess I live here now. And the Holstons loomed above it all in their ridiculous nightmare house, with its black iron grillwork and its red brick facades, and when they started dying, everyone sort of shrugged and figured they'd brought it on themselves, what with building a house that looked like it belonged in a gothic romance. The last member of the family died long before I was born, but I still know them. Everyone knows them. You can't grow up here and not know them, because dying wasn't enough to make them leave. See, they died too fast, some sort of disease that started with the youngest daughter and swept through the rest of them like a wildfire. They didn't change their wills, and they didn't dissolve the trusts that were supposed to make sure that hard times for any specific member of the family wouldn't deprive the rest of them of their precious ancestral home. No one can buy it. No one can sell it. No one can demolish it. When it falls down, which it will, someday, everything falls down someday, we'll be able to clear the land and reclaim it for city use, but so far, The annual inspections have failed to find anything, not even water subsidence in the foundation. The place is in perfect shape, especially when you consider that it's been standing empty and unattended for 70 years. Deer crop the grass so short that it looks mowed. Rain washes the windows, and wind blows the debris out of the gutters. It's enough to make you understand why people believe in ghosts. Which, supposedly, the house has. Mary Holston, the youngest girl, the one who got sick first. They say she still walks the halls, lonely, looking for someone to play with her. Forever. It's also enough to make the place a beacon for bored teenagers on Halloween night, like the lone candle lit in the middle of a swarm of moths. We don't have anything else to do out here in the sticks, and the adults have made it clear that while vandalism is a no-no, they don't patrol the grounds of the Holston house. If they leave it to our devices for long enough, we might be able to bring the whole thing down. Probably not, though. It's going to outlast me. It's going to outlast us all. Except for maybe little Mary Holston, with her ghostly garden growing in the shadows of the house where she died. We gathered outside the gates, a motley gang of bored kids who wanted the opportunity to smash things without anyone catching on. There was Elisa, with her spray paint and her bubble gum and her yellow hair and her tight black jeans, which always seemed like an invitation to stare and then feel bad about it later. Chuck, whose backpack bristled with eggs and jars of liquid that I could smell from where I stood, viscous and obscene. Aiko, with her baseball bat and her scowl that dared any of us to say a damn thing about it. Tyler, who always had bruises on his face and arms, and who never wanted to talk about them, but who could chuck a chunk of masonry with an artist's skill, taking out windows from 20 feet away. We greeted one another with nods and gruff insults, trying to seem cool, trying to seem casual, trying to seem like our hearts weren't pounding and our skins weren't too tight, like costumes we'd already outgrown. Or maybe that was just me. Elisa had never given any sign that she cared what people thought of her. Chuck's father actually liked bailing him out of trouble, like he was reliving his own chaotic teen years, one crushed mailbox and one egged house at a time. Aiko hated everyone, including her best friends, and Tyler. Sometimes I thought Tyler was hoping we'd get into the kind of trouble that ended with us being sent to juvie for a nice long stretch. Not hoping hard enough that he was willing to go out and start something on his own, but hoping anyway. He'd probably get beaten to a pulp in juvie. Any of us would. At least there, we wouldn't be related to the people doing the hitting. "Emily," said Aiko, in a voice like a razor blade. "You're late." I was getting supplies. I held up my backpack. She looked at it with dull disinterest. "Matches. A glass cutter. The good stuff?" "Why would we need a glass cutter?" asked Tyler. "Because if we can get into the house before someone calls the cops on us, we could find better shit," I said. He thought about it for a moment. Then he nodded. "Cool." That the cops would be called was a foregone conclusion. Even with the adults turning a blind eye to our nocturnal activities, as long as we were just participating in the town tradition of trying to trash the Holston place, someone would eventually hear glass shattering or smell smoke and decide we needed to be curtailed, lest we get so excited that we started trashing a house people actually cared about. Teenagers were wild animals, at least in the eyes of the adults who pretended to give a damn about us. We had to be controlled, or else we would run rampant. Elisa popped her gum. "How are we getting in?" "Bolt cutters," said Chuck, pulling them out of his backpack and brandishing them like a sword. Elisa clapped her hands. Even Tyler smiled. Aiko turned to frown at the chained gates, brow furrowing. "You see that?" she asked. "See what?" "Someone." She paused and shook her head. "Nothing. Just a trick of the light. Come on. Let's get this party started." The end of the world is probably going to begin with those 5 words. Let's get this party started. Just once, I wish someone would say, let's not. Just once. It's Halloween, whispered the wind through the eaves, blowing against the pressing dark of the October night. It carried dust and fallen leaves, and as it blew, it left them tangled in the cobwebs, knocking the spiders from their holes, sending them tumbling down into the tangled overgrowth of the flower beds like fat black raindrops. It's Halloween, hooted the owl in the trees at the back of the property, wings mantled and yellow, eyes wide, alert, staring at the house. It flexed its talons against the branch that bore it, splintering wood and bark alike, and when it launched itself into the air, it made no sound, but soared as soundlessly as a shadow. It's Halloween, breathed Mary, nose pressed to the glass of her bedroom window, eyes fixed on the figures coming through the gate. 5 of them this year, 5 trick-or-treaters coming to play with her, to be her friends, and maybe even, if she was very, very good, and very, very lucky, and if they were very, very clever, to stay for a while. Oh, how she hoped they would stay for a while. It's Halloween, she repeated, and hugged herself tight, watching her new friends come. This was the closest any of us had ever been to the Holston house. We were silent for a long while before Tyler finally put voice to what we'd all been feeling. There's some bullshit going on here, and I don't like it. Aiko, wary as a kicked cat, stopped and looked at him. What do you mean? She asked. Tyler gave her a challenging look. You can't tell me you don't see it too. I didn't say I didn't see it, she replied. I want to know what you see. The house, he said, and pointed. This fucking thing is, what, 1,000,000 years old? Older than my house, anyway, and my house has peeling paint on the corners, and the gutters always have half a ton of leaves in them. This place, there isn't a broken window. There isn't even any graffiti. How can this place be in such good shape when nobody takes care of it? And when this shit happens every year? Language, drawled Elisa, popping another bubble. He's got a point, I said slowly, and tried not to squirm as their eyes turned toward me. Their combined gaze seemed to have a palpable weight, like a shroud. Did any of you come out here last year? One by one, my friends answered in the negative. Tyler had been running with a different crew then, and had spent the night egging cars from the overpass. Elisa had been out of town following a little incident with the girl across the street. Aiko had been in New York visiting family. Chuck had been in some unspecified somewhere else, and refused to say more than that. I frowned. Okay, so how do we know that anyone has actually done this before? What do you mean? Asked Chuck. Maybe they were lying to make themselves sound braver. It was a believable theory. Most of the kids who claimed to have thrown a rock or taken a swing at the Holston house were milquetoasts, the kind of people who cared more about homework than hooliganism. The real troublemakers always seemed to find something else to do when Halloween rolled around. If the real troublemakers actually existed. I frowned, trying to find a face to put to that label. I could summon the vague image of a skulking gang of older teens in ripped jeans and leather jackets, hanging out behind the school and trying to look tough enough to take on the entire world, but it seemed like I'd never really seen them, only sketched the shadow cast by the things they had supposedly done. It was weird. Maybe they skipped class a lot. I shook my head to chase my lingering unease away and turned to Chuck. Cut it, I said. Who died and put you in charge? He asked, but he clipped the chain. It fell to the driveway with a muffled clink, metal striking stone, and the gates, freed from the tension that had been holding them in place, swung majestically open. The hinges didn't creak so much as sigh, soft and distant and weary. It was like this was a place where rust had never dared to grow, where time itself played by different rules. We moved closer together without discussing it, taking a little thin comfort from the proximity of people we were sure of. These weren't the distant shadows of the bad kids we were trying so hard to emulate, to grow up to become. These were my friends, assuming I could honestly claim to have anything of the sort. These were the people I had chosen to have my back while I rode off to become a Halloween legend. "It's open," Elisa said, and popped another bubble. The sound was sharp and bright and somehow pink, gooey around the edges. Only Elisa's gum could sound like that. "Who goes in first?" "What, are you scared?" Tyler swaggered forward, passing through the gate and only stopping when he was easily 10 feet onto Holston property. He turned to look over his shoulder, smirking, more for Elisa's benefit than for the rest of us put together, I was sure. Everyone knew Tyler was sweet on Elisa, just like everyone knew Elisa would never do a thing to encourage him. Near as anyone could tell, Elisa was attracted to bubble gum, spray paint, and Elisa. Which at least put her in a category with me and Tyler, so hey. She had good taste. Slowly the rest of us followed Tyler through. Elisa paused to produce a can of red paint from her bag and shake it to life, eyeing the wall around the gate with hungry eyes. "You go on ahead," she said. "I'm going to make sure anybody else who comes looking for a little Halloween fun knows that they didn't get here first." "You want to look out?" asked Tyler eagerly. Too eagerly. Elisa treated him to a withering look. "Go play, little boy," she said. "Maybe if you're fast, you can trick or treat at the big house before the candy runs out." She turned back to her wall, giving the can another shake, eyes far away, already picturing the masterpiece she was going to put there. Tyler muttered something nasty under his breath as he slogged down the driveway toward the rest of us. Chuck gave him a sympathetic look. Aiko did nothing of the kind. Her attention was reserved for the house, taking in the undented wood and undamaged windows with an artist's eye. And she was an artist, as were we all. Only our mediums differed. Elisa was a painter. Chuck was a performance artist, of a kind. Tyler was a dancer. Me, I liked to play the changes, a jazz musician with a hammer, or any blunt instrument, in my hand. Aiko? Aiko was a sculptor, and to her, the house might as well have been an untouched block of marble, ready for the chisel. "Let's go," she said, and her grin was a jack-o'-lantern carved out of the twilight, eerie and bright and flickering with unholy fire. Sometimes the trick-or-treaters didn't reach the door. They got scared, was what Cook said. They couldn't handle the majesty of the grounds, or the way the windows seemed to watch them. They didn't understand that the house only ever wanted to make friends, like Mary only ever wanted to make friends. Friends were important. "It's Halloween," Mary whispered, shivering with delight, and stepped out of her room, space bending around her until she emerged through the wall to the side of the gate, passing easily through the brick and mortar. The trick-or-treater who hadn't been able to make it to the house was standing at the wall, a canister in each hand, painting something wonderful over the brick. It was big, and red, and white, and swirled like a peppermint candy cane, sweetness and sharpness, waiting to cut the roof of the mouth when bitten into wrong. Mary clapped her hands. "What the hell?" The trick-or-treater spun around, eyes wide, mouth hanging open. A wad of something pink fell out, landing on the driveway with a splat. Mary frowned. "Littering is bad," she said. "You should pick that up. Mr. Evans says I'm not to litter the grounds ever." "Who the hell are you?" demanded the trick-or-treater. Mary was beginning to suspect this wasn't a good friend for keeping. "My name is Mary. I live here." "What's your name?" "No one lives here, kid. This is the Holston house." "Yes," said Mary patiently. "This is my house." The trick-or-treater stared at her, still not picking up the pink thing from the driveway. "No fucking way," she breathed. "You're dressed as Mary Holston? Your parents let you do that? Where are they? Is this some viral video bullshit?" "You shouldn't use that sort of language," said Mary. "It's not nice." "Yeah, well, neither is dressing up like a dead kid who," the trick-or-treater kept talking, but Mary wasn't listening to the words anymore. They were bad words, wrong words, big lying words that people weren't supposed to use around her. She needed to make the trick-or-treater stop using them. So she did. When she was done, when the screaming stopped and the trick-or-treater wasn't saying things anymore, Mary looked at the picture on the wall again. The candy cane swirls were gone. Now it was pink and yellow and sad, like a memento mori for something that should never have died here. Mary sighed, stepping back into the wall. Maybe the others would be more fun. After a moment, the thing that had been Elisa climbed to its feet. It left the paint cans where they were as it stood there silently, waiting for the others to return. We all heard the scream, but when we turned to look, it was just Elisa by the wall, which already bore the outline of another of her grandiose grotesqueries. I waved hesitantly. She waved back. "Bitch," muttered Tyler. Yeah, said Aiko, and eyed the door. "Emily? You have the lockpicks. You want to let us in, or you want me to start bashing?" That was one of the most polite things she'd ever said to me. I stepped into position, pulling the picks from my pocket and getting to work. The Holstons had been rich enough to afford good locks, but technology marches on. I was expecting something tricky but not impossible to pick, just hard enough to make me look cool in front of my friends. They might never be impressed by me. I was too plump, too slow, too reluctant to smash things when I thought we might get caught, but I could get into places, and so they'd keep on keeping me around. As long as I was willing to open doors, I was part of the crew. Even here. The picks moved, and the tumblers clicked, and in half the time I'd been aiming for, the door was swinging open, revealing a hallway as clean as it was old-fashioned. I held my crouch for a moment, unable to shake the feeling that something about this was very, very wrong. We knew the quirks of architecture and geography that allowed the Holston house to look so well maintained even when no one was actually taking care of it. They taught those in school, using them as examples of outliers. But here, were we supposed to believe that ravens flew down the chimney and swept the cobwebs away with their wings, or that raccoons wandered the halls accidentally dusting things with their tails, somehow not doing any damage in the process? Chuck whistled, long and low. "It's like a fucking museum in here." I had to swallow the sudden urge to tell him not to talk like that, not where the ghostly shadows cast by the moonlight flowing through the stained glass windows could hear us. Luckily, Tyler saved me the trouble, elbowing Chuck casually in the side. The bottles in Chuck's backpack jangled. "Someone's trying to screw with us," he said. "They came and cleaned the place up, and now they're going to jump out at us. Let's screw with them first." "You do what you want," said Aiko. Her eyes were on the great stained glass circle of the window at the top of the stairs. She'd be able to reach that easily with her bat if she climbed up to meet it. "What if the stairs are rotten?" I asked. Aiko looked at me coolly, dismissively, the way she looked at everything. "I'll still get to smash something," she said. "The house or myself, it doesn't matter." She walked away from us. Tyler whistled. "Okay, forget Elisa," he said. "I'm in love." "She's out of your league," said Chuck. "She's out of everyone's league," said Tyler. "I can hear you," said Aiko, and climbed the stairs to the sound of laughter. Chuck hooked a thumb toward the nearby hall. Tyler nodded, and the two of them skulked that way. I looked toward Aiko, silhouetted against that big round window, and followed them away from the door, deeper into the house. The second trick-or-treater was in front of the star window with a stick in her hand when Mary stepped out of the wallpaper. Mary frowned. These weren't good friends. They weren't even good trick-or-treaters. It was Halloween, and not one of them had said the words. It was like they didn't care. If they didn't care, Mary was going to make them care. "Breaking things is bad," she said primly. Aiko shrieked and whirled, bat held defensively in front of her. She blinked when she saw Mary, a frown spreading across her face, wiping her terror away. "You're just a kid." "This is my house," said Mary. "It's Halloween, and that means you don't need to be invited to come for trick or treat, but even uninvited, you're still supposed to act like a guest. Guests don't break things. Guests are polite." She took a step forward. Aiko took a step back. The menace radiating off the child was like smoke, intangible but filling the air until her lungs ached and her head spun. "Why do you want to break my things?" Mary asked. "It's Halloween. We're supposed to trick and treat, not break things that aren't ours. Kid, this window isn't yours. No one owns this house." "I do," said Mary. Unlike Elisa, Aiko didn't scream. Her baseball bat made a clunking sound when it fell from her fingers and rolled down the stairs. Her body was quieter when it hit the floor. Anyone looking closely at the great starscape of the stained glass window might have found the outline of a teenage girl, sketched out by distant points of light, screaming forever. But they might not. It could easily be a trick of the shadows, after all. There was no single sound that caught my attention as Chuck and Tyler were setting up their bizarre Rube Goldberg machine of jarred smells and pilfered antique kitchenware, clearly intending to bring the whole thing crashing down as soon as they had it stacked to their satisfaction. My role in this construction project was simple. I was the one who picked the locks on the china cabinets and eased open the ancient cupboards, keeping the boys safe from spiders. For a couple of guys fixated on projecting their own version of aggressive, unrelenting masculinity, they sure were freaked out by spiders. But something was different. Some small, indefinable quality of the air around us had changed between one breath and the next, becoming raw and wrong and unwelcoming. I turned away from the boys, frowning, trying to decide what was bothering me. Tyler noticed, of course. Tyler paid too much attention to the wrong things, and always had. "What's the matter, Emily?" he jeered. "You scared?" "Suck my ass," I replied genially. "Just because Elisa doesn't want anything to do with you, that doesn't mean you have to be a jerk to me." "Elisa doesn't want anything to do with you either, Dyke," he said. There was a darkness in his tone that matched the darkness in the house. "Don't say that shit," said Chuck. "Thank you," I said. "Whatever," Chuck said, and added another jar to his stack. I turned to look back at the pair of them, frowning. These were my friends? These were the people, out of the entire school, who I had decided were worth impressing, worth spending time with? Sometimes I think most relationships are nothing more than a matter of stumbling from loneliness to loneliness until we find someone whose company is better than being alone, and then putting up with their jackass associates until we realize it's not worth it after all. Elisa was hot and funny and could even be sweet, when no one else was around to see her doing it. Sure, sometimes I'd wondered whether she was like that with all of us, gentle and kind in private, flirty and rude in public, but I'd never wanted to think about it too hard, because if I did, I would need to decide how I felt about it. I wanted to have friends. I wanted to have people who'd have my back if things went south. But somehow, having friends always seemed to mean getting stuck with people who didn't really like me, and who I didn't really like either, while Elisa did her own thing and told us about how sick it was later. "I'm going to check on Aiko," I said. "Dyke," said Tyler again. I whirled. "I will shove one of Chuck's chemistry projects so far up your ass that you'll be burping stink bomb until you turn 35, I snarled. "There are words you don't use. They're not yours." "Nobody owns a word," said Tyler, looking at me coolly. "I'm just saying it like I see it. You see it like an asshole." His laughter followed me out of the kitchen and back down the hall toward where we had left Aiko. She wasn't my friend either, but at least she didn't go out of her way to insult me. Actually, she didn't go out of her way to do anything, good or bad, where I was concerned. Mostly, she looked at me like she was trying to figure out my deal, like once she understood me, she could decide what she wanted to do about me. There was nothing cruel in her gaze. Cold, sure, but not cruel. Aiko's bat was lying at the bottom of the stairs. I stopped when I saw it, blinking, unable to quite process what I was seeing. Aiko carried that bat everywhere. She took it to class with her, and when new teachers objected, she'd go home and come back with a note from her parents explaining that her mental health was directly tied to her possession of the bat. Our school had a zero-tolerance policy for weapons, which meant if anyone came right out and said, "But she could beat someone with that," they ran the risk of doing away with the entire baseball team in the process. Aiko was clever. She knew where the cracks in the rules were, and she knew how to exploit them. So why was her bat on the floor? Slowly I bent and picked it up. I'd never actually touched it before, and on some level, I was surprised when I was able to. It should have been like Thor's hammer, too heavy for a mere mortal to lift. It should have burned my hand. Instead, it was just an ordinary bat, with an ordinary weight, worn smooth by Aiko's skin. "Aiko?" I asked, in a small voice. There was no reply. Step by step, I climbed the stairs, moving toward the stained glass window, which wasn't broken, wasn't smashed, wasn't even cracked. It showed a vast field of stars, silver and gold against a background of blue, and must have turned this hall into an eternal twilight when the sun was up. There was something strange about the way the stars were placed, like they made some sort of picture I could almost but not quite see. When I saw what was on the floor, I stopped looking at the window. Aiko was crumpled there, folded in on herself like a discarded doll, her face hidden behind the careless tangle of her hair. I ran to her side, dropping to my knees and shaking her. "Aiko? Aiko!" She was utterly unresponsive, recalling and strengthening my first impression, that she was a child's plaything that had somehow displeased and been cast aside, to be reclaimed later when the offense had faded. I rolled her onto her back. Her open eyes stared up at the ceiling, the black strands of her hair crossing her irises like cobwebs. I brushed them aside, unable to stand her fractured, unblinking gaze. But she wasn't dead. She was breathing shallowly, and her skin was soft and warm. She wasn't dead. She couldn't be dead. I had come here tonight looking for a little good, old-fashioned mayhem, the sort of Halloween pranks that would make us gods at school and maybe, just maybe, bridge the differences between us, making us the sort of gang that stuck together through thick and thin, and not only when it was easy and convenient. I wanted that. I wanted it so badly I could almost taste it, like sugar on my tongue. There was a sound from the kitchen, short and sharp, the beginning and ending of screams compressed into a space too small to hold them. I didn't move. I closed my eyes, and cradled Aiko close, and wished I were strong enough to lift her up and carry her out of here, away from whatever haunted this place where the gutters never clogged and the floors never mildewed. Something was wrong with the Holston house. Something had always been wrong with the Holston house. For the first time, it occurred to me that there was a name for something shiny and untouched and perfect: lure. Or trap. Either would do. The adults we trusted, who were supposed to take care of and protect us, they'd sent us here, hadn't they? They'd talked about what a wonderful target this house was, how no one cared about it, how we could wreak whatever havoc we wanted without getting into trouble. They'd set the bait and we had snapped it up like animals, rushing out without stopping to wonder why generations of teens hadn't gotten here before us. There was a footstep behind me. The last trick-or-treater had found one of her friends and was holding her, rocking her, the way Mama used to rock Mary, before Mama had to go away. Mary paused. She didn't like remembering Mama, not really. Mama had gone outside the house before things changed, and when they'd changed, Mama hadn't been able to find a way back in. Cook said it was because Mama had been outside the gates, and outside the gates was a different world. Mr. Evans said it hadn't always been that way. Mr. Blake said Mama had done something when she realized things were going to change one way or the other, and that whatever she had done was the biggest trick and the biggest treat ever, because it was why they were able to stay here, Halloween after Halloween, no matter how much the world changed outside the gates. The Holston house would stand forever, because Mama had known her little girl was dying, and Mama had wanted to give Mary a house to haunt. "It's Halloween," said Mary finally, to the last trick-or-treater. The girl raised her head and turned, spitting words over her shoulder like an angry cat. "So do whatever you're going to do. Get it over with." Mary cocked her head to the side. This trick-or-treater didn't have anything that she could use to hurt the house or break things. She'd opened the doors, but she had done it gently, kindly, doing no damage, leaving no mark behind. It was Halloween. It didn't matter that she didn't have an invitation. What mattered was that she had come, and Mary had been so very lonely. "It's Halloween," she said again. "Do you want a trick, or do you want a treat?" The girl looked at her and said nothing, but there was hope in her eyes. Mary smiled. Mary took it. "She says she's my sister now, and I guess she's going to keep saying it until I forget it isn't true. This is the Holston house, after all. There's nothing here but time." We stood by the bay window, watching as the people who'd been my friends walked toward the gate where the girl who'd been Elisa was waiting. They looked small and strangely naked without the paraphernalia of their mock wickedness. The house had swallowed it entire, along with whatever it had taken from them. Less, according to Mary, than it would have taken if I hadn't agreed to stay, more than it would have taken if they'd listened to the things no one was saying and chosen to stay away. They would be good now. Good like the older teens, the ones we'd always been puzzled by, the ones who should have destroyed the Holston house long before we'd had the chance to go there. The ones who'd met Mary, who'd become her treats when she saw the tricks they were trying to play. Maybe this is the last time. Maybe next year, when Halloween comes, I'll be able to warn the naughty ones away, be able to tell them to go and throw eggs at some other, lesser house, one that's a little less protected, a little less aware. Maybe I can save them. Or maybe they'll find my body, the only thing allowed to decay in this haunted, hallowed place, dissolving into dust at the top of the stairs. Maybe they'll meet Mary, enjoying the holiday highlight of her year, trading tricks for treats for the whole town to enjoy. Holston, Oregon, is a nice place to live. Its founders, what remains of them, make sure of that. "It's Halloween," whispered Mary, and she slipped her insubstantial hand into mine, and held me tight. "She says she's my sister now. Give us enough time, and it will be true. Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow?" I didn't mean to ask the question. I asked it anyway. She looked up at me and smiled. "With graveyard weeds and wolfsbane seeds, and empty graves all in a row," she said. "It's Halloween." "Yes," I said, and the night went on around us, and the night would never end. The end. Next story. California Burning by Michael Blumlein. The guy at the crematorium said it would take about 3 hours. A little less if he was lean, a little more if he was fat, as fat burns slower. "Which is why it's so hard to get rid of," he added, patting his ample belly. He was a congenial man, of a different congeniality than the people at the mortuary, who were hushed, respectful, reserved, sedate, watchful, and preternaturally composed. The sort of people whose every mannerism and facial expression assured you it was perfectly all right to get emotional, to rend your clothes, pound your fists, sob till your throat was raw. They were all for showing your grief. And if you didn't, you felt a little embarrassed, as if you hadn't performed up to par. And if you did, you also felt embarrassed, for making such a fuss. The difference being that in the latter case you felt you'd done the right thing. Greg, the crematorium guy, was not reserved at all. He was the opposite, chatty and matter-of-fact. Fat burned slower, he explained, because it had more calories than muscle. You could get it to burn faster by raising the temperature in the oven, but then you ran the risk of blackening the air with smoke and pollution, which were no-nos these days. They had a camera trained on the rooftop chimney that was hooked to a monitor to check what was coming out, which at the moment was nothing. Or rather, nothing worse than the air itself, which was hazy from a nearby fire. It was summer, and where I live, summer meant fires. "Good day to be inside," he said. There was a box in the room. The box, I should say. 6 feet long, 1 foot high, it sat on a gurney, and without so much as a word of explanation or warning, Greg lifted the lid. I was determined to be cool. But it didn't turn out that way. My stomach lurched, and I choked back emotion. The box was plain and anonymous, but the bag inside was body-shaped. My father's name was printed in large letters, once at the foot of the bag and once at the head. There was a tag with a number that Greg removed for me to check against the number on a form I had. I was shaken by the sight of the bag and so relieved that he hadn't opened it and asked me to identify the body that I barely gave the number a glance. Dad's name was on the bag, not once but twice, and that was good enough for me. And even if by some fluke it was someone else, who would ever know? Ashes were ashes. A little more, weight-wise, if you were big, a little less if you were small. But quality-wise the same, a kind of gritty mixture of the soft ash of fully combusted flesh and organs combined with the coarse ash of bone. This, according to Greg, who was free with the info. Gold and silver fillings that might identify a person vaporized, and personal prosthetic devices like knees and hips and artificial heart valves were confiscated as potentially biohazardous and not included in the remains. There was a stainless steel tray where the bones that hadn't crumbled completely in the heat were pulverized by hand, then fed, along with the rest, through a funnel-shaped sieve, rather like sifting flour to get a more homogeneous blend. Attached to the tray was a container half-filled with blackened metal prosthetic parts. Like jewelry, but scorched. Of everything I had seen so far, this was the most disturbing. Strange how the mind works. I didn't flinch, for example, when he raised the door of the brick-lined oven and, again without a word, pushed my father in. I didn't flinch when the door snapped closed. And as the gas ignited with a soft hiss, I watched the temperature needle slowly rise without emotion. Perhaps it was this composure of mine that made Greg veer from normal procedure. Perhaps he admired me for it. Or maybe he thought that something was subtly wrong. At any rate, after the body was in the oven for a while, he opened the door. The cardboard coffin was on fire, somber red flames punctuated by bright curlicues of yellow. Centered almost exactly in the middle was the dark globe of my father's skull. He'd been bald in life, and I recognized the shape. It was him, and not only that, he seemed at peace. By which I mean it comforted me to think that. The flames appeared to be cradling him. They licked at his head but had not yet set it on fire, as though to honor him, his life, his achievements, his spirit, by not consuming him too fast. I left the crematorium at 8 a.m., called at 1, allowing time for the ashes to cool, to pick up the remains. I was told to call back later. I called again at 2, and then at 3, and then 4. Greg said it was taking longer than expected. I asked if there was a problem. Sometimes the ovens act up. Don't heat like they're supposed to. Which means what? That he can't be cremated? Oh, he'll be cremated all right. It just takes longer. How much longer? Why don't you call back in a few hours? Like when? Tonight? No problem. We operate around the clock. 24/7. You don't sleep? Can't afford to. They don't. In my mind's eye I saw a line of gray and expressionless men and women, waiting impassively to be slid in the oven and baked. It was a dreadful image. I wanted this to be done. Are you busy? I asked. Most of the time we are. It's steady. I mean now. Now? Not too busy. Can you fix it? Fix it? The oven. There was a pause, as if this was not exactly the right question. Sure. We fix them all the time. So tonight then? I can pick them up tonight? Right. Tonight. Call back. Everything'll be fine. As it turned out, everything wasn't fine, not by 9 that night, when the swing shift guy suggested I call back in the morning. And not by the morning. I got Greg again, a guy whom, in the short time I'd known him, I'd come to more or less trust. He was straight with me, and not unfeeling. It's not the oven. Sorry, Mun. What do you mean? My boss wants to talk to you. You talk to me. What do you mean, it's not the oven? He'll explain. Just tell me. There was silence. Please. He was a decent guy. He cared about his job, and in this case his job meant caring for me. My father, it seemed, did not want to burn. His skin and nails and organs, yes. They were gone. But his bones, no. Somehow they had resisted 24 hours of 1300-degree heat and flame. Greg had never seen anything like it. His boss, however, had. He'd been in the business almost 30 years and had seen, in his words, a little bit of everything. We met in his office, which adjoined the crematorium. There was an old-fashioned oak desk piled with papers, a chair behind it and one in front of it, a dirty window, a concrete floor. By the look of things he wasn't used to visitors. At another time I might have been interested in what he meant by a little bit of everything. He was certainly interested in telling me, as though the existence of other unusual happenings and odd occurrences would be a comfort. Rather like expecting someone with a broken bone to be comforted by the news that other people were in pain. I didn't want to hear about it. What's the problem with my father's bones? He was leaning against the front edge of his desk, his shirt collar open, his thick, calloused hands on his thighs. He looked like he could have been a fighter at one time. His face was carefully composed. They don't want to burn, he said. And why is that? I wish I had an answer. We gave it all we got. Greg mentioned something about the oven. Thought maybe it was acting up. Nothing wrong with the oven. We just had it serviced. It's working fine. But this is what you do, right? You cremate bodies. 29 years, he said. But not mine. I meant my father's, of course. He rubbed his thighs, as if to clean his hands, or expel something. It reminded me of my father in his hospital bed, just a few days before he died. Picking at his gown over and over, at a thread or piece of lint or something that no one else could see, something that simply wasn't there, then tossing it over the side of the bed. I would take his hand and hold it, but he would pull it away, again and again, so in the end I stopped trying and instead just sat beside him and watched, transfixed and disturbed by what he was doing. There was no purpose to it. He wasn't himself. Or else he was, who else could he be? And the purpose of this repetitive and disconcerting activity was hidden to me. I'm fully prepared to give you your money back, the man said. And then what? You can use it to bury him. We don't want to bury him. He didn't reply. No offense, but maybe we should try someone else. Sure. By all means. Do that. Wouldn't you? I told you what I'd do, he said. My father actually had suggested that when the time came, he be buried, but my mother was opposed. Her mind was set on cremation. She wanted to scatter his ashes and be done. She didn't want a grave to have to visit. Her mother and father, whom she adored, were buried in graves, and she didn't enjoy the feelings that visiting them stirred up in her. She didn't like being tied to her loved ones in that particular way. Ever the gentleman, my father had agreed. You said you'd seen this before. He nodded. One time. 6, 7 years ago. We were using higher temperatures then. Didn't matter. Same thing. Man or woman? Man, what did he die of? He didn't even have to think. Heart attack. What did your dad die of? The strange thing was, no one knew. He went into the hospital complaining of shortness of breath, and 12 days later he was dead. Having lost his mind completely, also for unknown reasons, in the process. Not his heart. His heart was fine. What did you do? The other time? I called around. Talked to some guys in the business. Everyone had had a case or two. Or if they didn't, they knew of one. So this is not unheard of. No. It's not. It happens a lot? He shrugged. It happens. Knowing this, that we weren't alone, did, in fact, help. But only a little. So with the other one. The other body. What did you end up doing? Same thing I'm doing now. I talked to the involved parties. I let them know this was not the outcome we planned. Not the one we wanted. I tried to help, just like I'm trying to help you. Did they have a burial? The other time? Don't know. They didn't say what they were going to do. Like you, they were upset. If my dad were alive, he would have been embarrassed at having caused a problem, embarrassed at being the center of attention, embarrassed at the fuss. If you told him he wasn't crematable, he wouldn't have asked why. He'd have said fine, do what you have to. Or rather, he would have said, don't upset your mother. Make it easy on her. Do whatever she wants. I'll have to talk to my mother. Of course. I stood. He said, can I get you to sign some papers before you go? He produced them, I signed them, he punched a number into his phone. He lifted the receiver and spoke into it briefly, and a minute later, Greg came through the door. He was carrying a plain cardboard box about the size of a crate of oranges. It had a fitted top and cutouts for handles at either end. He placed it on the desk. It took me a moment to understand what it contained. I packed them real good. Nice and snug. There shouldn't be any problem with shifting or rubbing or slippage. He stared at his feet, hesitating. The top I wrapped separate. And I put it in a bag. Just in case, you know, you don't want to look at it. The top? His hand drifted up to his head. Suddenly, I didn't feel so well. Weak in the knees, unsteady upstairs. Strangely, or maybe not so strangely, I wanted to throw up. Or cry. Or both. Can a person do that? I made an inventory, just so you know. It's on a piece of paper. In an envelope. I was afraid to ask what he meant by inventory. His boss, however, felt obliged to explain. There were a lot of bones in the body. He didn't know how many, but a lot. And they weren't held together anymore, because whatever it was that held them was all burned up. The ashes, what there were of them, which wasn't much, were in a small plastic bag. The bones, none of them touching, were packed separately, according to shape and size, not to how they fit together naturally. So I might not recognize which was which, and unless I happened to know anatomy, which I didn't, I certainly wouldn't be able to say that all the bones were there, that the body was complete. Which is why we made the list. I nodded, but I barely heard a word he said. I was thinking of my poor mother. I was thinking of my father's skull. I was also trembling. I felt like a little boy, being asked to be brave. My father, I sensed, was watching, not unsympathetically. He more than anyone would have understood. Inventory? You've got to be kidding. There was no way I was opening that box. But I did have to take it. At first I put it beside me in the passenger seat, but after a block or two I moved it to the back. That was still too close, and a few blocks later, I put it in the trunk. When it comes to disposing of a person's ashes, it seems that it's hard to go wrong. You can toss them to the wind, spread them around and dig them into the ground, charter a boat and scatter them at sea. You can do it as soon as you get them from the crematorium. You can wait a month, or a year, keeping them in an urn or a box, in private or in plain view on a shelf. You can keep them forever and never dispose of them at all. By some common decree, ashes are immune to misuse. Just about anything you do is acceptable. But, aside from burying them or bequeathing them to science, what are you supposed to do with bones? I put them in the living room, on a side table. My cat Chester made an exhaustive study of the box, seeing and smelling things, no doubt, far beyond my pale human senses. To me it looked gray and smelled like cardboard. The more I studied it, the more I should have stopped. For where Chester excelled in senses that were grounded in reality, I excelled in ones that were not. I fantasized, for example, that my father was alive and trapped inside. I fantasized he was a ghost. I fantasized he was troubled, restless, and was going to haunt me, not necessarily because he wanted to but because that's what people with unfinished business did. This was not good. Not good at all. What was I going to tell my mother? That was a Monday. The nearby fire, which was mostly brush, had been contained, but now there were other fires, and on Tuesday, the forest to the north of us went up in flame, filling the sky with billows of black smoke. It was the driest summer on record, and by Wednesday there were 100 fires, and more igniting every hour. For mile after mile in every direction the air was thick and gray and nasty. People with respiratory conditions were advised to stay indoors, then that was amended to include everybody. I watched TV, transfixed by news of the fires, witness to something that seemed both terrifying and monumental, historic, apocalyptic, a turning point of some sort. 400 fires, 800, 1,000, all up and down the state. California burning, the headlines read. My father's resistance to flame, his unburnability, seemed somehow part and parcel of this. Sphinx-like, inscrutable, the box sat on the side table as if daring me to understand. What was I to do? The doorbell rang, and I nearly jumped. 2 men were at the door. For an instant I feared that I was being evacuated. Like most people, I didn't want to go. One was tall, the other stocky and broad. The tall one looked to be in his 60s, the stocky one, in his late 30s or so, a good 10 years older than me. They were dressed conservatively in suits and ties. They introduced themselves and said how sorry they were to hear of my father's death. I thanked them and asked how they knew him. We didn't know him personally, the older one, Michaels, said. Felt like we did, said the other one, whose name was Neil. It was nice what they said in the paper. Good man. Exceptional, said Michaels. Outstanding. I wish I had known him. A fine man all around. The younger one, Neil, handed me a card. We were wondering if we could have a minute of your time. I looked at it, then him. Bereavement counselor? He frowned. His buddy Michael snatched the card out of my hand, read it, then narrowed his eyes. Wrong card, he told Neil, who stammered something and blushed. He's only been doing this a little while, he explained to me, returning the card to Neil, who pocketed it, fished out his wallet and withdrew another one. After a moment's hesitation he offered it to me, but Michaels took it first. He examined it, gave a little nod, looked me in the eye in a friendly sort of way, and passed it on. This one read Department of Public Health. Which one are you? I asked. We're health officers, said Michaels. We received a notice of an irregularity. We're following up. Strictly routine, said Neil. Nothing to worry about. Michael seemed to tense slightly. Larry. Why would he worry? He wouldn't. Like I said. We know it's a difficult time, said Michaels, cutting him off, but we'd like to ask you a few questions. Do you have a minute? It won't take long. Is there a problem? No problem. None at all, added Neil. Routine visit. We'll be gone before you know it. The two of them stood there for a while, not looming exactly, but not going away. At length Michael said, "May we come in?" There is something gravitational about authority, compelling in an almost physical way. Without thinking, you find yourself drawn to it. And you want to be, that's the thing. You like the feeling. You want a piece of the action, whether or not you believe in it or plan to obey. I opened the door wider. Then I remembered the box. Hold on a minute. I hurried to the living room, picked it up and carried it to my bedroom. But the bedroom seemed too obvious, which was a strange thought to have, unless, like me, the only thing stronger than your trust in authority is your distrust of it. My apartment is small, and room-wise, all that was left was the kitchen. The box didn't fit in the oven, and hastily, I stowed it under the sink. "Something cooking?" Michaels asked when I returned. "Cooking?" He motioned toward the kitchen. I was caught off guard. "You guys want coffee?" I asked. They didn't, and I ushered them into the living room. We all sat down, and under Michael's watchful eye, Neil began. "Again, our condolences." "Thank you. We understand your father passed away unexpectedly. And rather fast. For some reason that irked me. He was 12 days in the hospital and 83 years old. Is that fast? And of unknown causes. Like I said, he was 83. But not especially sick before he went into the hospital. Say a day or two before. No. Not especially. He nodded in a knowing sort of way, then cleared his throat. "Forgive me for asking, but did you consider doing an autopsy?" "No. I didn't." "Any particular reason why not?" In fact, the thought had crossed my mind, but only briefly. He was 83, after all. I didn't see how it would have helped. "How about your mother? Was she interested?" I thought of her expression the day she came in and he didn't recognize her, or anyone, the day he became delirious. How her face had crumpled, and her eyes had teared up, and she couldn't speak, except in little sobs. And how after a minute she gathered herself and sat beside him, taking his hand in hers and speaking to him in a calm, reassuring, almost chatty voice, reminding him who and where he was, affectionately chiding him for not knowing. The 11 days between his entering the hospital and his dying were for me a blur, but for my mother, I think, it was the opposite. Time slowed to a crawl. She was not shocked or surprised when he died. She was relieved more than anything, both for his sake and hers. She had known him for more than 40 years, and no autopsy would have enabled her to know him any better, or changed how she felt. No. She wasn't. Not at all. Interesting. Why is that interesting? Michaels was quick to reply. What Mr. Neal means is, you can understand our interest. From a public health standpoint. Rapid death. Unknown cause. There is a cause. The cause was old age. He regarded me for a few seconds, then inclined his head. It gets the best of us. Why don't we leave it at that? I do have another question, said Neil. I was beginning to grow impatient. Neil especially was getting on my nerves. What is it? It has to do with his bones. What about them? We understand there was an irregularity. Is that right? He nodded. Word gets around. Michaels, sensing the tension, intervened. Again, it's a regulatory matter. The crematorium is required to inform us of any unusual occurrence. I replied that it wasn't that unusual. It had happened before. Has it? That's what the man said. Not often. But then my father didn't always do things the conventional way. It was a light-hearted comment. I meant nothing by it, and Michaels let it slide. But Neil was the sort who saw meaning and motive everywhere. How so? I was joking. He frowned, then gave a bogus laugh. Oh. I see. Huh. You mean your father was conventional? Sometimes. Sometimes not. He was unpredictable? I wouldn't say that. In the end. How would you describe him then? He was delirious. Yes. That's what the hospital notes say. He wasn't himself. Did he talk to you? He was babbling. About? Nothing. It was nonsense. Could you understand it? Sometimes. Most of the time not. He wasn't satisfied with this. Could you be more specific? You couldn't understand the words? Or the words were put together in a way you didn't understand? I don't know. Both, I suppose. He exchanged a look with Michaels. Can you remember any of them? The words. Not really. Did you recognize any? Had he said them before? Some of them. Sure. The ones you didn't know. What's this have to do with his bones? Bear with us for just a moment, said Michaels. We're almost done. Did any of the words sound foreign? I don't remember. He mumbled a lot. Had he ever acted that way before? No. Never. He never behaved unusually? Like, say, someone you didn't know? A stranger, said Neil. Did you ever think of your father like that? I'd had enough, especially of him. Do you have a father? Is that a yes or a no? It's a question. If you don't know the answer, maybe I can help. Let's get back to his bones, said Michaels. We'd like to have a look at them. Would you? And why is that? Because we're public health officials. And it's the law, said Neil, although the look he got from Michaels made me wonder if he'd made that up. Why are you so interested? Is there some danger to the public? Some sort of health risk? We won't know until we examine them. But what's the likelihood? Really? I couldn't say. I suspected he could. Moreover, I began to feel the need to defend my father, as though his honor and integrity were at stake. Which was ironic, because of all his qualities these were the ones that he, and I, and nearly everyone who knew him, valued most. They've cooked for a whole day at more than 1,000 degrees. Is there anything you know of that survives that kind of heat for that long? Anything that could possibly harm anybody? There was a pause. Somehow the word harm changed the whole tenor of the conversation. Neil glanced at Michaels, who wore a grave expression, then at me. If you don't mind, we'd like a look. They're not here. Where are they? I had to think fast. Somewhere else. Lame? What can I say? Neil started to reply, but Michaels stopped him. Can you arrange for us to see them? He asked. When? Tomorrow, say. I wanted to get rid of these guys, and the quickest way, it seemed, was to agree. Besides, I was out of snappy rejoinders. Tomorrow it is. Excellent. We'll see you in the morning. What is it about health officials that leaves you feeling anxious, worried, vulnerable, agoraphobic, headachy, sick to your stomach, tight in the chest, sweaty, itchy and insecure? Bacteria in the food supply, pesticides in the water supply, smoke in the air supply, obesity, cigarettes, heart disease, ADD, depression. It's a dangerous world out there, hazards everywhere, and these functionaries seem to delight in reminding us of this, bludgeoning us with statistics and sharing, if not manufacturing, the most alarming trends. But how bad really is it? The people I see look like people I've seen all my life, only more of them, and, I have to say, on the whole they look better. Take my father, for example. He used to smoke, like nearly everyone his age, then he stopped. Then he got fat, like ex-smokers do, then he got rid of the fat. He looked good when he was 70, he looked good when he was 80, and he looked pretty darn good for an 83-year-old, all the way up to the last 2 weeks of his life. A stranger? Yes, he was, in those final few days. And before? Who isn't a stranger to some degree, even to his closest companions? I knew my father as a son, but what did I know of him as a husband, or a friend, or a son himself? What secrets did he have? And what thoughts and experiences that weren't secrets at all, merely too pedestrian and numerous to mention, or too far in the past, too dim, to recall? Of course he was a stranger. On some level, we're all strangers to each other. But I feared those men meant something more. After they left and I calmed down, I called my mother. Some friends were making a condolence call, so she couldn't talk long. She asked how I was doing, which is how she starts every conversation, and I told her everything was fine. How about you? How are you? Everyone's being very nice, she said. Are you sleeping? Not too bad. I'm not eating much. I don't have much of an appetite. There was a pause. Why is that? She sounded puzzled, as if she'd never known anyone who'd lost a loved one and heard them describe what it was like, the loss of appetite, the sleepless nights, the sudden and recurrent shock of being alone. In fact, she had paid countless condolence calls of her own and had many widowed friends. Because your husband just died. People lose their appetite. It's pretty normal. So I shouldn't worry? Are you eating anything at all? Some soup. I had a piece of toast. Then no. You shouldn't. You'll be fine. But everybody's bringing things. Chicken salad. Meatloaf. Lasagna. The food's just piling up. But you like those things. I'm not hungry. But they keep bringing them anyway. You'll be hungry later. You can freeze them. I'm not helpless. I can cook for myself. You might not feel like cooking. I could see the look on her face. It's annoying. Just so you know. I didn't die. Your father did. Grieving, for my mother, was a relatively new condition, but being aggrieved was not. The latter for her was sometimes an expression of discontent but more often of worry, which itself was an expression of fear. What she feared most was losing something, her independence, her self-control, someone she loved. In this case, she had lost all those things to one degree or another, and I did my best to reassure her. We made a date to see each other the next day, and I hung up, relieved, temporarily, to have avoided the subject of my dad. The fire situation worsened that afternoon. At one point there were a reported 1,400 blazes throughout the state. One would get contained, and a score of others would take its place. Forests were being consumed, homes destroyed, thousands upon thousands of firefighters mobilized, countless lives imperiled. The closest blaze to us was a scant 20 miles away, and the air outside my window had to be the epicenter of the smoke. I could barely see across the street. The sun was a blur, and the light was brown and eerie. This is how the world will end, I thought. Maybe it's ending now. Not with a bang but in a slow, deepening, sunless shadow. I stayed inside and watched the news. I made some calls. I searched the internet on the subject of bones, bone conditions, bone diseases, skeletons, burials, decomposition, cremation. I learned that in acromegaly the bones are unusually thick. And in something called osteogenesis imperfecta, unusually thin and fragile. I learned that the monks of a certain Catholic sect in Rome collected the bones of their brethren and made sculptures out of them. I learned many fascinating facts, but nothing that helped me in the matter of my father. His bones were still under the kitchen sink, an ignoble hiding place, but the living room was too exposed, and, call me squeamish, but I did not want them in the bedroom. So I left them where they were and said good night, paused, then said, I'm sorry about this, Dad, paused again, then said, I miss you, Dad, turned back and said, I love you, Dad, then went to bed. In the morning there were ashes everywhere, on the trees, on the cars, in the street. There was barely a county in the state that wasn't on fire. The governor had declared a state of emergency. The president, bless his heart, sent condolences. I had decided, for the time being, to leave my father's remains where they were. My mother, of course, had to be told, and I was thinking about that when the doorbell rang. It was Neil and Michael's again. I was nonplussed. I had called and left a message to cancel our date the night before. Didn't you get it? I asked. They frowned and looked at each other. Did you get a message? Michaels asked Neil. Neil shook his head. Did you? Michaels shook his. This is a bad time? It's inconvenient? Yes. It is. I'm sorry, kropka. And he looked it. A moment passed. When did you leave it? He asked. Leave it? The message. Last night. What number? The air was burning my eyes. By the looks of things, there's two. Common courtesy obliged me to invite them inside, which I did. I don't know. The number you gave me. The one on the card. That's funny, said Neil. Michaels agreed. Maybe you punched it in wrong. I've done that, said Neil. Plenty of times. It's not as easy as it looks. Those little pads. Those tiny little phones. It's not easy at all. Anyone can make a mistake. Don't worry about it. Not for a second. Please. Do me that favor. It's not worth the trouble. That's what I'm saying. Stuff happens. He glanced at Neil. Am I right? Neil rolled his eyes. You got to be kidding. All the time. Like yesterday. Neil gave a nod. Yesterday's a case in point. You probably thought we were stringing you along. Lying to you. Lying strong, Larry. Misinforming you then. Not laying our cards on the table. Maybe you thought that. You didn't trust us. You weren't sure who we were or what to do. You suffered a tragedy. You're trying to sort things out. You've got a lot on your mind. A lot of feelings. Some this way, some that. You didn't trust yourself, said Michaels. You had the bones, but you didn't want to tell us. You thought it was disrespectful to your dad. You weren't sure what to think. You wanted to help, but you didn't want to do the wrong thing. That's exactly right. Neil pointed a finger at Michaels, as if to single out his razor-sharp intellect. You hit the nail on the head, Mike. He wanted to help, just like he wants to help now. He turned the finger on me. He wants to help, but he doesn't want to make a mistake. Doesn't want to blow it. Like before. With the phone. The wrong number. The phone, the information, the car, whatever. What about the car? I asked. He gave me a look. The car, I repeated. What's wrong with it? He transferred his look to Michaels. He's asking about the car, said Michaels. What about it? Michaels shrugged and turned to me. What's the deal? Is something wrong? You said car. He frowned. No, sir. I did not. He did. I pointed at Neil. Michaels turned to him. He said it was you. Neil looked thoughtful. Interesting. Maybe he didn't hear you right. It's possible. Mistakes happen. He addressed me. Can you hear me now? I heard you before. Say it. What you thought you heard. The word. I was annoyed. This was ridiculous. Car. Not this? He made a sort of gurgling in his throat, very brief and, I have to say, weird. Like water running over rocks, where sometimes you think you can almost make out words. Larry, behave. Familiar? He asked. I felt like it should have been, but I shook my head. He looked disappointed. Michaels intervened. Maybe you said card. Or Carl. Who's Carl? Asked Neil. Or card. Maybe card. He scratched his head. Could have been that. Come to think of it, I was thinking about a card. He reached in his pocket, pulled out his wallet and slid a card out. He handed it to Michaels, who glanced at it before giving it to me. Now please, don't take this the wrong way. Advice, naturally, that ensures you will. I looked at it, and my heart froze. Embossed on it, In large, no-nonsense, steel blue letters were the three initials no one ever wants to see. Who among us is not guilty of something? The two of them watched me, waiting, it seemed, for some reaction. You look worried, said Neil. Michaels nodded. He does. I think he's taking it the wrong way. You said not to. I did. But obviously we're not communicating well. Do you understand me? Sure. I don't talk with an accent? Neil grinned. Not to me. And the words, they're clear? Like crystal. But still there's a fundamental problem. Like a dog talking to a cat. Like different languages. But related. Definitely related. Neil nodded. It happens. Between people. Communication difficulties. All the time, said Michaels, taking the card from me and tearing it in half. It's just a card, for Chris Sake. Anyone can make a card. What you should be looking at is the deliverer. Look at me. I did, and what I saw was not what I expected. His eyes held a depth I hadn't seen before. They were warm and, dare I say it, friendly. I was almost taken in. You want me to trust you? Is that it? Sure I do. Who doesn't want that? Good cop, bad cop? He looked chagrined. Larry's not bad. I gave Larry a glance. He's not exactly reassuring. Vive la différence. And we're not cops. Excuse me. Federal agents. You have a suspicious mind, my friend. You make me suspicious. With all your questions and innuendos. And your stupid cards. He considered this for a moment. The cards, perhaps, were a mistake. I apologize. I nodded at the one he held in his hand, torn in half like a losing lottery ticket. How do you expect a person to react to that? It's a problem, I admit. Those letters, we should change them, said Neil. Michaels agreed. We should. They're not what you think. Neil said something in a rapid, fluty voice, like birdsong. That's how it sounds in the native tongue, said Michaels. Or how we think it did. It translates roughly into, friends of our deceased. The F was right, but the O's and the D were nowhere on the card. You're pulling my leg. He shook his head. We're not. Friends of our deceased. F-O-O-D, said Neil. Maybe we should put that. And I thought, are you dumb or something? Neil smiled at me. Pretty dumb idea, huh? I stared at him. What native tongue? Michael said a word I hadn't heard. It's more or less extinct. What the hell is it? Friends of our deceased? He rattled off some names, 2 or 3 I recognized as friends or acquaintances of my father. It's a group? He thought for a second. Sure. A group. You could call it that. What do you do? Why this? He gestured, as though it were obvious. What? Visit people. You visit people. Sure. And talk to them. Help out. That's it? We do other stuff too. Like what? He looked apologetic. We don't usually talk about that with outsiders. So it's a secret group. Not secret. Private. And my dad was a member. He seemed to understand how this might be troubling to me. I'm sure he was a member of other groups too, he said gently. This was true. He was a member of a number of groups. And maybe some, like this one, I didn't know about. So you're here on behalf of this group. To help me. That's right. Fair enough. So tell me this, how is it going to help me for you to see my father's bones? We can help you decide what to do with them, he said. Do you have a way to cremate him? No. We don't. Then I don't think you can. He protested, as did Neil, and repeated their request to see the bones. I had this to say, the message I left. The one you didn't get? To cancel our meeting today? Maybe it was a bad connection. You didn't hear it right. The words were garbled. Maybe you didn't understand. I paused, expressing my regret. I'm so sorry. You're not. If you give me a number, maybe one that's more reliable, I'll call you if anything new comes up. More protests, but I was done. Neil didn't take it well. He issued various veiled and not so veiled threats, but he had no power, as it turned out, legal or otherwise, to back them up. Michaels was more resigned, as though he half expected this. He handed me a new card, this one with his name on it. He lingered a moment, then suddenly and without warning reached out and gave me a hug. He said my father would be proud of me. He said to call if I changed my mind. Then he and Neil left. I saw my mother later that day. She lived on the other side of town. Ash was in the air and on the ground, floating like snowflakes and stirring around my feet like dust. The heat and smoke were insane. Traffic was light, proving that people can, if they put their hearts, minds and souls to it, use common sense. I would have liked to use common sense too, but Mom and I had some things to discuss, and the phone just wouldn't cut it. This had to be face to face. She had made iced tea, a drink best taken outside, but we stayed in the kitchen. She wore shorts and a blouse and no makeup. Her cheeks were naturally pink, her eyes naturally large and dark, her face unnaturally drawn. The first order of business, to show that the world had not come to a halt with her husband's death and that she was okay, was to complain about her hair. This she did more by gesture than by word, grabbing it, scowling, looking annoyed and exasperated, shaking her head. She hadn't been to the hairdresser since the week before he died. Initially, she hadn't wanted to, and then it didn't seem proper. It looks fine, I told her, for which I received a look that said, "Are you an imbecile? Who raised you?" Because I know it couldn't have been me. I made an appointment for Saturday. Do you think that's all right? Sure. Really? Mom. You're the widow. You get to do what you want. I don't want to offend anyone. She did have the power to offend, typically with her tongue, and usually without meaning to, or even knowing. But maybe now that Dad was gone and she was alone, things would be different. The fact that she was concerned enough to mention it was a positive sign. Look how much you'll offend people if you don't get it done, I pointed out. Really? It looks that bad? It looks fine. You have beautiful hair. And she did, salt and pepper and spry, at the grand old age of 70. I felt a wave of affection for her and planted a kiss on her head. How are you? She asked, relaxing a little. I mentioned the fires, which she hadn't been following. News and current events were not at the forefront of her mind. How awful, she said. Are you okay? So far. It was a thoughtless reply, and I regretted it instantly. Fine. Your father would have left. They're not advising us to. Not yet. There was a big fire here, God, it must have been nearly 30 years ago. You were a baby. They weren't telling us to leave then either, but he packed us all up and took us to a motel. Playing it safe, this sounded like Dad. Once we were settled in and he was sure we were okay, he drove back and helped fight it. You're kidding? I'm not. Dad did that? She nodded, and her eyes shone. Your father was full of surprises. What else? I don't know. Whatever they do. Hosed things down. Dug things out. He came back and got us in a couple of days. I mean other surprises. What other ones? Oh, that. She thought for a moment. A surprise birthday party for me. A surprise vacation. He loved planning surprises. And keeping them to himself. He prided himself on that, and with good reason. I can't remember a time he gave a secret away. She paused, smiling at something. What? I asked. Oh, I was thinking about you. You were another surprise your father gave me. Completely unexpected. I was 42. Who would have thought? But what a gift. Really. What a miracle. The best ever. The memory of it lingered on her face. Tenderly, she asked if she could fix me something to eat. I wasn't hungry, but she opened the refrigerator anyway. Within seconds, she was scowling. Why do they keep bringing me things? It's such a waste. All this food. I wish they'd stop. Mom. Come siete? I have something to tell you. Her face became utterly still. What's the matter? What's wrong? I coaxed her beside me, then told her about the remains. She was puzzled at first, as if she didn't understand what I was saying. I had to tell her again, then test her further with the small detail that no one had an explanation. She wasn't happy with the news. Who could be happy? But, leave it to her, she wasn't derailed. Call someone else, she said. I did. They won't take him. Not the way he is. What does that mean? It meant that word had gotten around. That no one thought they could do any better. No one had offered to try. It means I want to talk to you about alternatives. She folded her arms and pressed her lips together, girding herself. I want you to consider burying him. In the past 2 weeks she had lost weight. There were hollows at her temples and in her cheeks, making her eyes, which were large to begin with, more striking than ever. And those eyes regarded me, and it was a wonder I didn't turn to stone. Just consider it. Not necessarily do it. But think about it. No, thank you. Why not? We discussed it already. I don't want your father somewhere in the ground. I don't like it. I've never liked it. Okay? Things have changed. We have to change too. Not in this. Mom. Please. Be reasonable. She looked at me, and slowly her face softened, and I felt the change that every child feels, or longs to feel, and maybe sometimes fears to feel, as her attention shifted from herself to me and her motherliness took center stage. You're upset. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I wish there were something I could do. You're not upset? It's your father, she said, as if this explained everything. Is it? He can be difficult. You know that. And stubborn. Lord, I never met a man so stubborn. And I thought, was that what this was? A character trait? I learned long ago not to argue with him. It only makes things worse. So what do you suggest we do? Explain to me again why they can't, why he won't. She couldn't quite finish the sentence. No one could tell me. No one knew. Well, maybe we should find someone who does. A bone specialist. A doctor? Why not? Coming from her, this was a remarkable, really, an extraordinary, suggestion. The woman had a lifelong distrust of the medical profession, rivaled only by her deification of it. And sure enough, a moment later she reconsidered. Well, some kind of expert. She paused to think. Maybe Adolf. Adolf? You know Adolf. Adolf Krantz? Why not? He went to college. He studied chemistry. He's a smart man. And he was very fond of your father. I hadn't seen Adolf since I was a boy. He was one of my father's oldest friends. I didn't see how he could help, but if my mother thought he might, it was worth a try. If I talk to him, will you listen to what he has to say? Will you take his advice, even if it's different from what you think? From what your mind is set on? He wrote a very sweet note. Will you? He'll get a kick out of seeing you. Mom. You're pestering me. Will you listen to him? She didn't say no, I'll give her that. Talk to him. Let's see what he says. There was one more item, which was apt to upset her, though with Mom you never knew. The smallest thing could cause the biggest reaction, and the biggest, she could take in stride. As it turned out, she didn't know either of the men, nor the group which they claimed to be members of. But she wasn't particularly alarmed or surprised that they knew my dad. He and she shared many of the same beliefs and memberships, but not all. And in the interest of marital peace and harmony, some things they kept to themselves. I asked if Dad ever seemed strange to her. She laughed. Your father? Very odd. But you get used to it. Look, we were married 43 years. How? How what? Was he odd? You knew your father. He had his way of doing things. It wasn't my way. Which, as you know, is perfect. Did he ever seem different from other people? She gave me a look. You ask the weirdest questions. Of course he was different. Everybody's different. I mean different from normal. Different in some other way. The look narrowed. What are you driving at? I'm not sure. Then let me tell you something. Your father was an exceptional man. He had his quirks, who doesn't? But when it counted, he was always there. For both of us. If you have any doubts about that, my advice to you is, don't. I didn't have doubts, not about that, and for her the conversation was over. I had some food, which always made her happy, agreed to take some home, which made her even happier, kissed her goodbye and left. The men visited me once more, this time in a dream. They were dressed the same, but they looked different. Their faces were rubbery and their arms and legs were long and loose. They moved like seaweed underwater, like eels, like smoke. I couldn't take my eyes off them. I think maybe they were hypnotizing me. I wanted to be with them, but they were underwater and I couldn't breathe. I tried to go after them, but I could hardly move. And my chest was starting to hurt. I opened my mouth, but I couldn't get any air. I tried and tried, but something was blocking my windpipe. The men were watching without emotion, while I was suffocating. My chest was ready to burst. Which is how it must have felt to my father the night he was hospitalized. He couldn't breathe either. It's a terrifying feeling. Thank God, I awoke. The person who invents the twistless, tangleless, knotless sheet will be enshrined in the sleepless Hall of Fame. Along with the one who invents the sweatless, soakless, self-cleaning pajamas. What did this dream mean? Aside from the fact that I was afraid to go back to sleep. That these men were not what they seemed? No surprise there. That I felt threatened by them? I did feel threatened. My heart was racing. But why? Eventually, I did get back to sleep, a very light and fitful one, as I tried to strike that hopeless balance between vigilance and repose. I woke tired and grumpy, with the sense that something had to be done and the desire that someone would do it for me. After a strong cup of coffee, I was ready to take action myself. I hadn't seen Adolf Krantz since I was a child, and I'd never been to his home. He lived outside a small town a couple of hours north of me in an old ranch house in a quiet neighborhood of parched fields and beautiful, stately oaks. The air was dry and caustic with smoke when I arrived. A cinder, or even the thought of a cinder, and the house, and everything near it, would be toast. I parked at the curb, passed through a chain-link gate and up a cracked concrete path to the front door. I rang the bell. After a minute I rang it again, and at length the door opened. An old man peered out. Day-old whiskers, hawk-shaped nose, boxy black-rimmed glasses that magnified his eyes 2 or 3-fold, a flurry of white hair. I gave him my name. A moment passed, and then he offered his hand. I'm Krantz. Call me Adolf. I was sorry to hear about your dad. Come in. He led me inside, moving slowly but steadily, down a hall and into a small, paneled room full of books and odds and ends. There were 2 leather armchairs facing each other across a chessboard. Only a few pieces remained in play. He took one of the chairs. Do you play? I know how the pieces move. That's about it. He studied the board for a moment, then leaned forward and advanced one of the pawns. Your father never liked the game. Though he'd play if I asked him to, back in the day. He hated this part. Endgame. Too slow for him. Not enough action. He pointed to a pawn on my side of the table and asked me to move it. He studied the board a minute or 2 more, and satisfied, sat back and studied me. You look like your father. You have his eyes. People used to say I looked like him too. To me that was a great compliment. I admired him enormously. There are not a lot of us left. US? That's right. Hardly any. What do you mean, us? The gang. The tribe. He paused. What did we call ourselves? He couldn't remember. Food? I ventured. What about it? Was that the name? He gave me a look. Food? I nodded. What kind of name is that? I told him what it stood for, at which point, I believe, he ceased to take me seriously. You're needling me. I'm not. Your dad used to needle. I'm only telling you what they said. Such a needler. The king of needling. The Needlemeister. What an education, watching him work. A thing of beauty, your father. He had the softest touch. He fell silent, and I could see him remembering. The years seemed to melt away. A smile lit his old, craggy face. We did pretty well for ourselves, didn't we, Mickey? Considering what we had to work with. Where we came from. What we had to do. Pretty damned well. Mickey was my father's nickname, from the old days. Only a handful of people used it. Evidently, Adolf was talking to him. We've got nothing to be ashamed of. You a high school dropout. Me a college bum. Adolf? He glanced at me. Mickey's not here. He looked lost, but only for a moment. Why would he be? But you. Listen. Be proud of your father. He was a good man. A wonderful person. You know how we met? The story. You know the story? Some of it I did, but only bits and pieces, mostly from my mom. Dad didn't talk much about the past. I came over when I was just a kid. Your father was a year or two older and already here. My family took a room in a house in the neighborhood. 5 of us in a single room. I didn't know anybody. I didn't speak the language. I didn't know my way from a hole in the ground. Scared? You bet I was scared. Excited too. Scared and excited at the same time. Everything was so different, so strange and unusual, and one day I walked out the door, and there was your father. He was sitting on a fire hydrant, playing with a piece of string. He smiled when he saw me. I've been waiting for you, he said. He spoke your language? He spoke German? Your father? German? Never. Not a word. So how'd you understand him? How do you think I understood him? He made himself understood. He took me under his wing. Became a big brother to me. That's how they worked it. The buddy system. Everything in pairs. Who worked it? The ones who sent us. The program. For me, mandatory. Your dad, if I'm not mistaken, was a volunteer. For what? A volunteer for what? He thought for a moment, and a smile spread across his face. The rest of his life. And then some. That's for what? Don't ask me how long, because I can't tell you. As you see, I'm still here. Apparently, he found this amusing. To me it was annoyingly obtuse. You said you were sent. By whom? The senders. Who are the senders? I was 5. What does a kid know when he's 5? He gave me a look. Your father never talked to you about this? No, never? I shook my head. Then I assume he didn't want you to know. Know what? Some do, some don't. Tell people. It's an individual decision. It's not up to me to decide otherwise. Out of respect for your father, may he rest in peace. Out of respect for your mother. And for you. This wasn't good enough, not by a long shot. I asked him again what it was I didn't know, but he refused to say another word. I wasn't about to get down on my knees. Not literally. I did, however, let a certain plaintive, importuning tone enter my voice. But he wouldn't budge. So I tried a different tactic. The men who visited me. Are they part of this thing? Do they know? He didn't recognize either of their names, but my description of Michael's seemed to ring a bell. They came to pay their respects? They wanted a look at him. At his bones. Who are they, Adolf? I'd imagine another unit. Another pair. Did you let them see? No. I didn't trust them. They were secretive? Extremely. And you found that annoying? Distasteful? Unpleasant? Yes. He nodded, then fell silent. Nearly a minute passed before he spoke. I understand. Ido. But imagine for a moment if they weren't. What do you mean? Imagine if they were completely open and honest. Imagine if everyone was. Now take that one step further and imagine if everyone shared everything. If there were no secrets, no hidden thoughts, no privacy. If everyone knew everything about everybody. No separation between people. No boundaries. No misteri. Imagine a world like that. Every channel open all the time. Everything revealed. How does that sound to you? He didn't wait for an answer. We've tried it. It fried our little brains. Almost fried our future too. Better a little privacy. A little ignorance. Trust me, it's no crime to know a little less. Then I'm in good shape, I thought. I had no idea what he was talking about. Why won't his bones burn, Adolf? Ah, yes. That question. Do you have them? As a matter of fact, I did. They're in the car. He nodded, as if he'd expected no less. The answer to your question is I don't know why. I only know what you know, that they won't. He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He did resemble my father, and the look he gave me, searching and warm, resembled him too. Have you thought of burying him? He asked. My mother won't allow it. It's a common custom, you know. I do know. But it's not up to me. Throughout the world, among a great many groups, as different and diverse as they can be, to hazard a guess, I'd say the custom is quite universal. And I use that term in the broadest possible way. He replaced his glasses and leveled his eyes at me. Did it ever occur to you that the men were there for that? What? To bury my father? Yes. To bury him. Simply that. They didn't mention it. And it didn't occur to me. Not once. A failure of communication perhaps. But it doesn't matter, does it? Your mother won't permit it. She has that right. Certainly she does. The right of the survivor. We should do our best to honor her wishes. Perhaps it's time you brought him in. Him was not exactly how I thought of what I had, but I did agree that it was time, and I left the house and went to the car. By now it was late afternoon, and the sun through all the smoke and haze was a blurry ball of red. A woman pushing a stroller passed me on the sidewalk. She smiled, and I smiled back. A brief but warm and very human connection. But then I asked myself, what did her smile signify, what did it mean? And what did mine mean, and were our meanings the same? What did it mean to share something? To understand someone? To be inside another's skin or their head? And then I thought, us. The word Adolf had used. They sent us. Who was us? And the senders, who were they? The box was in the trunk. I hadn't opened it, and I didn't intend to, but I had a feeling that Adolf did. I was willing to let him, as long as I didn't have to watch. It was my dad after all, not some random bag of bones. And frankly, in my mind he was still living. Though not, I admit, living very well. The image I had of him was an elderly man who in his last days was not at all the man he was. That's the trouble, if you can call it that, of someone living to a ripe old age. You tend to remember them as old. If they happen to be sick, especially if the sickness was prolonged, you remember them that way. I'm sure it gets better with time, easier, that is, to recall earlier days and younger selves, but at the moment what was freshest in my mind was Dad in the hospital, restless and agitated, not recognizing me or my mother, awake but clearly somewhere, if not someone else. The word possession comes to mind, but it was more the absence of possession, as if something structured and maybe even made up, like a facade, were gone. Stripped away, to reveal a deeper, and frankly, deeply disturbing, inner self. Had I seen this person before? The one with barely a thread of connection to the real world, the world, that is, that most of us lived in and knew? Maybe I had. Once when he got so mad while driving he had a near-fatal accident. Once when he got so drunk he started singing in someone else's voice. Another time, or several times, when he and my mother fought. Mostly he was not this way, and I loved him, but he did have a temper, which, when it came, made me think of him as monstrous, those bulging eyes, usually so mild, that strained and frightening voice, that blood-red face. So yes, I do have memories. But pretty thin evidence for his being other than what he was. Because that's what we're talking about. The A word. No one's using it, too scared, too diplomatic, too worried about what the family might say or do or think, too protective of us and our feelings. Whatever. But that's what they mean. So maybe last night's dream was a message. Maybe it was the voice of truth. Those weird, inhuman bodies. Those shifting, watery faces. Not that I believe in such things. Not that I necessarily don't. It does raise some questions though. Like, where did you come from, Dad? How many of you are there? Any special powers? Weaknesses? Does Mom know? At a certain age, I'm not sure what, but I think preteen, if you'd told me my dad was an alien, I'd have said cool. Go Dad. Part of it bravado, part of it pride, part a confirmation of how I was feeling anyway about him and the world. Face it, when you're a kid, everything's alien to some degree. But at an older age, like now, it's different. I want to know what it means, and what it meant then, and why he didn't tell me. I want to know who the hell I was living with, and listening to, and trying to impress. Who was I modeling myself after, and doing a pretty good job, judging by the result, and what does that make me? The fact is, my dad did have powers. He was good at business. He was super good at cards. He was super modest. When it came to sports, he was super slow. And vulnerabilities? His kryptonite? He didn't always believe in himself. He had a weakness for food and drink. He got angry over and over at the same things. He was stubborn to a fault. The bones were a perfect example of his stubbornness. Their resistance to being burned really shouldn't have surprised me at all. When Dad didn't want to do something, he wouldn't do it. The more you tried to get him to, the harder he'd dig in. If he does have a spirit, it's a good bet that it resides in this, the hard-headed, infuriating, refusal to budge persistence of his damn bones. They weren't much heavier than the box they were packed in, but when I removed them from the trunk, I felt a weight much like what I felt when he and I would square off. The weight of expectation, but more than anything, the weight, the sheer mass, of that stubbornness of his, and not knowing how to respond to it, give in, and let him have his way? Be stubborn back and show my mettle? Should I open the box and force myself to look at him? Would that prove something? If he were watching, what would he think? If he were in my place, what would he do? Adolf was waiting when I returned. He'd cleared the table of the chessboard, and I placed the box there. He looked at it for a long time before speaking. You've not opened it? No, but you want to. I shook my head. He looked at me and at the same time laid his palm on the box, pressing it there as though to steady himself, or else to steady and maybe comfort who or what was inside. He didn't reply, and at length I said, I do and I don't. He nodded. You have an urge. A small one. A sense of obligation. I shrugged. Have you ever seen a man's bones? He asked. In books. And museums. Up close? Not so very close. Ever held a skull? No, it's an interesting business, skulls and bones. But not so interesting that a man should have to look at his own father. I advise against it. Unless you're used to such things, the sight can be more than a little unsettling. There's no reason to inflict it on yourself. It can leave an indelible scar. I thanked him. I did feel an obligation, and his words helped relieve it. So what do we do? What's the plan? You're asking my advice? Yes. Please. He folded his hands. Very well. Leave the box with me. Leave it? Come back tomorrow and I'll give you his ashes. How are you going to do that? Not by fire, he said. How? He didn't reply, and I recalled that he had been a chemist. Possibly he was going to use some chemical method. Possibly that method was illegal, and he didn't want to implicate me. I'd like you to trust me, he said. I'd like to. Good. A moment passed. He gave a knowing smile. The question is, will you? If you tell me how you're going to do it. And if I can't? Can't or won't? Can't, he said. Then I'd want to know why. The smile deepened. Of course. And I'd say that why is unimportant. Or rather, secondary. Inessential at this time. Our job is to honor your father and take care of your mother. And of you. That's the business at hand. We can continue our conversation later, though I'm not sure you'll end up knowing more than you do now. The older you get, the more you learn to be satisfied with less. At any rate, now we should do what we have to. Who is he, Adolf? You know who he is. I don't. Forgive me, but you do. This was my father's oldest friend. My mother trusted him, and I wanted to trust him, too. I longed to trust him. But I couldn't, not in this. I thanked him for everything and left the house, the box in my arms. He watched from the doorway as I slid it in the trunk, doing nothing to interfere. I pulled away and drove a few blocks, then stopped and moved the box to the back seat. A few blocks later, and I moved it to the front. The sun had set, and the moon was low in the sky, shrouded gray. It looked like a hole through which all the smoke and soot might pour and disappear, leaving the world, my world, clean and whole again. In the distance along the edge of a hill was a smudge of red where another fire raged. My heart was heavy. I stopped the car. Adolf was right. I did know who he was. And that person wasn't in the box, or behind some secret door, or in what people thought or hinted about him. Who he was inside me. And knowing this was knowing a lot, and it made the decision of what to do next easy. The fires continued to ravage the state, until it seemed we had entered an era of flame. If you didn't see one, then you saw smoke, and breathed it in and tasted it. But then one day, miraculously, the sun rose in a sky that was nearly blue. And the air was nearly fresh. And that was the day we scattered his ashes. Some, at Mom's insistence, we sprinkled on a pathetic little planting strip beside Oak Mall, which was all that remained of a park where she and Dad had courted. The rest we scattered on a hilltop overlooking town. Adolf had sealed them in a heavy-duty plastic bag, which he had thoughtfully placed in a stainless steel urn. My mother, who normally notices such things, made no comment, but to me the urn looked suspiciously like a large martini shaker. Were they my father's remains? My mom certainly thought they were. And I was inclined to think so too. If they weren't, they were doing what they had to. They were fulfilling their purpose. It's a terrible thing to live in a constant state of doubt. It's hard, sometimes excruciatingly hard, to always be unsure. Whoever my father was and wherever he came from, the earth had him now. But we had him before, and without question he had us.